This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 39 of Season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, September 24th, 1910, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. Henry Bayneau, who has been so critically ill with typhoid fever, is holding his own, with sincere hopes of his ultimate recovery. His name was spelled, in the Wardsman anyway, B-E-N-E-A-U-L-T. Miss Louise Crosby, who has been spending the summer with her home people at Prince Edward Island, has returned to Mrs. Edward Prescott's. There were a large number of immigrants from Canada in Westford in 1910. The 1910 census shows 415 persons born in Canada French, which would be mostly from Quebec, but some from the Maritime provinces, and 123 persons from Canada English, Ontario and the Maritime provinces. Mr. and Mrs. Walter Cutter are entertaining a little son. Newell Irving Cutter, his name was. It's not given in the newspaper. Born to them last week Thursday, September 15th. This makes their fifth son, 3 that are living and 2 who have died. Nahum H. Wright quietly observed the 79th anniversary of his birth last week, September 15th. His longtime friend and townsman, George Haywood, paid him a visit that day. Nahum was a widower, his wife Abby having died in 1896, and Nahum himself would die in November of 1910, just a couple months down the road from when this was written. Mr. and Mrs. Will E. Carver are receiving congratulations at the advent into their home of a little daughter. Mrs. Quincy W. Day is ill at her home and under the doctor's care with an attack of bronchitis. Reverend and Mrs. David Wallace and Mr. and Mrs. Emery J. Whitney attended the recognition service held by the Littleton Congregational Parish for their new minister, Reverend Mr. Packard, last Wednesday evening. Reverend Wallace was the pastor of the Union Congregational Church on Lincoln Street in Westford. Mrs. Jonathan T. Colburn is seriously ill at her home with asthma and complications. Mrs. Abby Garvin Wright passed her 77th milestone of life's journey last week, Thursday. A pleasant birthday reception was arranged for her by her nieces, Mrs. Lewis and Miss Newcomb. Neighbors and friends came to call, bringing gifts and felicitous greetings. The rooms were prettily decorated with flowers and refreshments were served. The club program for the Tadmuck Club for the season 1910-11 has been issued to the members. Without they are attractive in their pretty modest gray covers with ribbon to match, and within there is much of promise for instruction and entertainment, and the arrangement for the season reflects the greatest credit upon the executive board and also indicates that the resources of the membership are not exhausted. The topic for study is Spanish North America, and this is interspersed with other timely topics. A good representation of the Edward M. Abbott Hose Company attended the 31st convention of the Massachusetts State Firemen's Association in Lowell this week. The ladies' degree staff of the Grange is at work with rehearsals for the third degree work for the coming fall initiation. Mrs. Fred A. Snow is the newly chosen master of the staff in place of Mrs. Frank C. Wright, who did not feel able to continue with the office. The next section is the About Town section. 2 of the children of August Nelson at Mills Corner, Lowell Road, have typhoid, and not the family of Nelson at Brookside Corner. The Republican caucus will be held at the Town Hall Wednesday evening, September 28th, to choose delegates to the several conventions and a town committee to serve from January 1911 to January 1912. Clarence R.P. Decatur is champion for potato yield in this town, having raised over 40 bushels from half a bushel seed. The Pride of Bethel. Pride of Bethel is in quotes and has initial caps. I presume that's the name of that variety of potato seed. John O. Sundberg is preparing for winter, a new house for himself and other small Sundbergs. Just at Brookside on the Lowell Road, and P. Henry Harrington of Graniteville has the contract for this cozy cottage. Oscar R. Spaulding and others' grand tour returned home on Monday evening, much refreshed in behavior and beauty. They reported an epidemic of typhoid fever in Montreal, Canada, and over 100 deaths. The water was the suspected cause, hence the Westford party took other fluids, but came home straight. Westford was well represented at the Middlesex North Agricultural Fair at Billerica last week. The display of fruit and vegetables was large, both in size and quantity. J. Everett Woods has been reappointed by the Selectmen, a member of the Board of Registrars of Voters. The board held a meeting last week Friday evening at the Selectmen's Room. J. Everett Woods was elected chairman, and the following dates were fixed for future meetings. Brookside, Friday evening, October 21st from 7:45 to 8:45. Graniteville on Monday evening, October 24th from 7:30 to 9 at Healy's Hall. Forge Village on Wednesday evening, October 26th from 7:30 to 9 at Abbott's Hall. Westford Center at Town Hall on Saturday, October 29th from noon until 10 o'clock in the evening. Of the two sick children of August Nelson, one died Tuesday of typhoid fever, and burial was on Wednesday at West Chelmsford. They were mentioned in a previous paragraph in the Westford Center section. Forge Village is the next section. Services at St. Andrew's Mission were conducted last Sunday by Reverend Mr. Burkhead of Groton School, who preached an interesting and forceful sermon on, quote, religion of today, end quote. At the close of the service, Mr. Burkhead announced that a parish meeting of great importance would be held in the parish house at Ayer on Thursday evening. Albert Gurney, Mrs. Stella and Blanche Gurney of Lowell spent Sunday at the Gurney Cottage on the shore of Forge Pond. Miss Teresa Lowther entertained the members of her Sunday school class on Sunday afternoon at Hollingshead Cottage on the shore of Forge Pond. That's Hollingside Cottage. The afternoon was pleasantly spent, and light refreshments were served in the open-air dining room. Everyone received, as a souvenir, a dainty box of chocolates. Those who attended were Gertrude, Hazel, and Blanche Comey, Annie and Mary Cherry, Carolyn E. Precious, Lottie and Mildred Parrott, Annie and Ida Reed, Edith Spinner, and Edith Hunt. Charles Flanagan, who had an excellent position with the Groton School for Boys, who have been in camp at Belgrade, Maine, throughout the summer months, has arrived home and has taken up his duties as flagman at the Boston and Maine crossing here. Miss Stella Carkin of this village and Miss May Barton of Lowell have returned home after 2 weeks outing at the White Mountains. Frank Bennett of Worcester and Walter Bennett of West Townsend spent last Sunday as the guests of Mrs. Harriet E. Randall. Miss Rovey Bennett of Worcester arrived on Tuesday and was Mrs. Randall's guest the rest of the week. Miss Sarah J. Precious and Miss Emily Collins visited Saturday and Sunday at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Michael Keefe. The next paragraph is called Interesting Meeting. Loyal Self-Help Lodge, IOOFMU, that's the Oddfellows Lodge, held a very interesting meeting in Abbott Hall on Monday evening. A delegation from Loyal Neshoba Lodge of Littleton attended and gave a brief but interesting account of Odd Fellowship. William Burnett, one of the oldest members of Self-Help Lodge, read a report on Odd Fellowship, which was greatly enjoyed. A short musical program was given as follows: song, My Big Brother, by Charles Flanagan, responding to an encore with Lily Dale. Piano solo, John Shackleton. Song and dance, William Baker. John Shackleton was the accompanist of the evening. A full attendance is requested at the next meeting, which will be held on October 3rd. All arrangements have been made for the dance, which will be held in honor of the 100th anniversary of the order. The next paragraph is a death. Joseph Bennett, an old and highly respected resident of this village for many years, passed away on Sunday evening, September 18th, at his late home on Pleasant Street in Ford's Village, aged 72 years, 8 months, 24 days. Although Mr. Bennett had been confined to his home by illness the past 3 weeks, his death was not expected, and it came as a great shock to his family and numerous friends. His daughter, Mrs. August Meyer of Boston, had come to spend a few days with her father and was preparing to return home when the end came. Another daughter, Mrs. Theophilus Jones, and her husband of North Chelmsford also came to spend the afternoon and only arrived a short time before his death. Joseph Bennett was born December 25th, 1837, at Staffordshire, England, and at the age of 21, he married Miss Elizabeth Hutchinson of Bradford, England. To them, 13 children were born, and 8 of them are now living. In 1887, he came with his family to this village and was among the early English immigrants to settle here. A few years later, he purchased his home, where, with his late wife, who had been his faithful companion through life's journey over 50 years, he had spent his declining days. Mrs. Elizabeth Bennett died March 22, 1909. He leaves to mourn his loss 8 children: William Bennett and Mrs. Silas Ellsworth of Providence, Rhode Island, Daniel Bennett of Worcester, Mrs. August Meyer of Boston, Mrs. Theophilus Jones of North Chelmsford, Mrs. William Hosmer, Mrs. Priscilla Bennett, and Joseph Bennett of this village. That should be Miss Priscilla Bennett, and Joseph Bennett of this village, also 27 grandchildren. Funeral services were conducted at the home on Wednesday afternoon at 2 o'clock. Reverend Sharon Billings of Groton School read the impressive service of the Episcopal Church and the committal prayers at the grave. There was no singing. The bearers were Silas Ellsworth, William Hosmer, and August Meyer, sons-in-law, and William Orange, grandson of deceased. There were many beautiful flowers, the offerings of loving friends and neighbors who had gathered to pay their final respects to one whom they had esteemed and respected through life. Burial was in the family lot in Fairview Cemetery. Mrs. W. Vickers of Stafford Falls, Connecticut, and William Bennett, quartermaster on the USS Vermont, were among those from out of town who attended the funeral. The next section is the Graniteville news. Notices have been posted about town for the Democratic caucus to be held in the town hall Tuesday evening, September 27th, for the purpose of choosing delegates to the Democratic state, councilor, congressional, county, district attorney, senatorial, and representative conventions of 1910. Mr. and Mrs. Levi Grant and Mr. and Mrs. Harry Ingalls of Beverly were recent visitors in this village, coming over the road in Mr. Grant's touring car. The regular meeting of Court Graniteville 170 MCOF, that's the Massachusetts Catholic Order of Foresters, was held in their rooms on Thursday night. Harry Hartford of Westford and Alfred Hughes of this village put up a great game with Townsend in their game with Greenville at West Townsend on last Sunday. These are 2 Westford players who are playing for the Townsend baseball team. Hartford covered second base in a creditable manner and got in 3 nice hits. Hughes accepted all of his 6 chances at short without an error and got in his customary 2 hits, one of them coming in a critical stage of the game when there were 2 men on bases. Young Hughes, he was aged 82 at the age 22 at the time, is certainly a coming ball player all right, and his good work of the past 2 seasons makes him eligible for faster company. The next section is called A Pleasing Service. Old Home Day was fittingly observed in the Methodist Episcopal Church here last Sunday, when special services with appropriate music were held both in the morning and evening. At the morning service, the sermon was preached by Reverend Minor H.A. Evans of South Boston, a former pastor of the M.E. Church. He was the first pastor of the church, actually, beginning in 1869 when the church was completed, and serving until 1871, and then serving a second time from 1876 to 79. A pleasing feature of the service was the singing by the male quartet from the men's club, composed of Henry Smith, Louis F. Havermale, Frank Conter, and Oscar A. Nelson. The choir was also augmented for the occasion, and the whole service was very pleasing. At the evening service, Reverend Louis F. Havermale preached an eloquent sermon from the theme, The Great Homecoming. The male quartet also ably assisted at this service. Both the morning and evening services were largely attended, many out-of-town visitors and former parishioners being present. The Old Home Day observance was somewhat new to the members of the M.E. Church, and the pastor, Reverend Louis F. Havermale, is to be commended for introducing such a pleasing service. The last paragraph is called Football. Many of the sports in this village are now thinking of forming a football club to represent Graniteville on the gridiron during the fall season. This village is well equipped with material for a first-class football team, and the only thing lacking at the present time is the services of a hustling manager who will take full charge and get things moving along. A meeting will be held in the near future for the purpose of electing a manager and getting a list of players who will give their full attention to football for the next few weeks. It is understood that Ford's Village and Westford are getting rapidly into trim, so Graniteville will have to get busy if it wants to be considered a live one. That's the news in Westford for the week ending September 24th, 1910. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.